The letter arrived on a Wednesday. It was not long. It did not need to be. It told a young man named Thomas Woodward, 20 years old, employed at a textile mill in Leeds, that he was required to present himself at the induction center on Albion Street at 8 o'clock on the morning of the 14th, with one change of clothes, his identity documents, and nothing else. The government would provide everything else. What the letter did not tell him, what no letter of that kind ever told the man receiving it, was what everything else actually meant. It did not tell him that within 72 hours of presenting himself at Albion Street, he would be on a train heading south with 300 men he had never met. It did not tell him that within 3 weeks he would be on a ship in the North Atlantic, in a convoy of 60 vessels, with a German submarine known to be operating in the waters ahead. It did not tell him that the journey from a textile mill in Leeds to a theater of war on the other side of the world was a process with its own geography, its own logic, its own moments of boredom and terror, and the specific disorientation of a man being moved by forces entirely outside his control, from the life he understood to the life the war had decided he was going to have. The movement of men to war in the Second World War was the largest organized movement of human beings in history. 50 million soldiers were mobilized across all the belligerent nations between 1,939 and 1,945. Each of those 50 million made a journey from home to induction center, from induction center to training camp, from training camp to the port or the airfield or the railhead that marked the boundary between the world they knew and the world the war occupied. The logistics of that movement, the ships and the trains and the trucks and the landing craft and the aircraft that carried those 50 million bodies from where they were to where the war needed them, represent one of the great organizational achievements of the 20th century. And they are almost entirely invisible in the way that logistics is always invisible, because the story that gets told is a story of what happened when the men arrived, not the story of how they got there. This video is about how they got there. In this video, we will follow the journey of the Second World War soldier, from the moment of mobilization to the moment of arrival in a theater of war across the troop trains that moved men through the blacked out cities of wartime Britain and America, across the troop ships that crossed oceans under submarine threat, through the landing craft that carried men from ships to beaches, and through the trucks and the marching columns and the occasional requisition bus that moved soldiers the last distance from the shore to the front. It is a story about what travel at that scale, under those conditions, actually felt like from inside the body of the man being moved. The troop train was where most soldiers first understood, in a physical and immediate way, that they were no longer living in the world that had produced them. The transition from civilian to soldier happened in stages: the induction, the medical examination, the issuing of uniform, but it was the train, more than any of those formal processes, that made the transition real. A man sitting in a blacked out carriage, heading south from Leeds toward a training camp he had never heard of, in a county he had never visited, surrounded by men from streets he did not know, was a man who had, in the most literal geographical sense, left behind everything that defined him. The town he had grown up in was receding behind him in the darkness. The mill he had worked in was receding behind him. The family he had eaten breakfast with that morning was receding behind him. What was in front of him was darkness. And in the darkness, the shapes of other men in the same situation, and the sound of the train, and the particular quality of silence that fills a carriage full of young men who have too much to think about and no adequate language for any of it. The troop trains of wartime Britain moved on a schedule that was governed not by the peacetime timetable, but by the operational requirements of the military, which meant that the men on them frequently did not know where they were going, how long the journey would take, or what they would find at the end of it. Security restrictions prohibited the display of station names along the route the signs had been removed from platforms across Britain in 1000, the event of German invasion. And a man looking out of a train window at night in the blackout saw nothing that told him where he was. The experienced soldiers learned to navigate by elapsed time and approximate direction. The new men simply sat and waited for the train to stop and for someone to tell them what to do next, which was, they were discovering what being a soldier mainly involved. The food on the troop trains was the first introduction to the institutional catering that would define the soldier's relationship with eating for the duration of the war. It arrived at irregular intervals in forms that bore a relationship to civilian food that was theoretical rather than sensory sandwiches made with the bread that wartime rationing produced, filled with paste or processed meat, wrapped in grease-proof paper that had absorbed the flavor of its contents in ways that the contents had not benefited from. Tea came in quantities that were the only aspect of the provision that no soldier complained about, because tea at sufficient quantity and sufficient regularity was the one thing that British military catering understood with a completeness it did not bring to any other aspect of the food supply. The men drank it from tin mugs and looked out the blacked-out windows and waited for the journey to end. For the soldiers of the British and American forces who were deployed to theaters of war beyond the reach of the trained North Africa, the Pacific, the Far East, the troopship, was the central experience of the journey to war. And it was an experience that most of them were entirely unprepared for. The great troopships of the Second World War were, for the most part, converted civilian vessels, the great ocean liners of the interwar years, stripped of their peacetime luxury and refitted to carry military personnel at densities that their original designers had not contemplated. The Queen Mary, which in peacetime carried fewer than 2,000 passengers in comfort, was configured in wartime to carry 15,000 soldiers at a time across the Atlantic. The arithmetic of that reconfiguration expressed itself in every dimension of the shipboard experience, in the sleeping arrangements, in the feeding schedules, in the sanitary facilities, in the simple physical question of where 15,000 bodies put themselves during the hours when they were not sleeping or eating. The sleeping arrangements on the troopships were the first thing that confronted a soldier with the reality of what the word mobilization meant when applied to the specific cubic footage of a ship's hold. Hammocks were slung in tiers in every available space below decks 3, 4, sometimes 5 deep, with a clearance between each hammock and the one above it that was measured in inches rather than feet. A man who had grown up in a terraced house in Leeds with a bedroom of his own was now sleeping in a canvas hammock 18 inches above another man's face, in a space that smelled of diesel and salt water, and the accumulated bodily presence of hundreds of men in an enclosed area with inadequate ventilation. He learned to get in and out of the hammock without disturbing the men above and below him, because disturbing the men above and below him had social consequences that were immediate and unambiguous. He learned to sleep in the hammock despite the motion of the ship, because the alternative to learning was not sleeping, and not sleeping on a 3-week ocean crossing had its own consequences. He learned, in short, the particular discipline of living in extreme proximity to strangers that the war required of him, and he learned it quickly because the ship gave him no alternative timeline. The threat of the German U-boat was a dimension of the troopship experience that existed for the men on board as a constant background presence that occasionally became a foreground one. The convoys that moved troops across the Atlantic and the Mediterranean were targeted systematically by German submarine warfare throughout the war. And the men on the troopships knew this, not from official briefings, which tended toward the reassuring, but from the evidence of the convoy itself, the destroyer escorts moving in patterns around the formation, the regular depth charge explosions that were felt as a vibration through the ship's hull when a submarine contact was made, the lifeboat drills that were conducted with a regularity and a seriousness that distinguished them from the peacetime formality they resembled. A soldier lying in his hammock in the hold of a troopship in the mid-Atlantic at 2 in the morning, feeling the depth charges through the steel of the hull and listening to the change in the engine note that meant the ship was altering course, was a man engaged in a particular kind of waiting, not the active waiting of a man preparing to do something, but the entirely passive waiting of a man inside a metal vessel in the middle of an ocean, doing nothing, able to do nothing, in a situation where the outcome was entirely outside his control. The Pacific presented the American soldier and the American sailor with distances that had no equivalent in any other theater of the war. The distance from San Francisco to Guadalcanal is approximately 5,000 miles. The distance from San Francisco to the Philippines is approximately 7,000 miles. The distance from the continental United States to the island of Iwo Jima, where 22,000 Japanese defenders waited in a network of underground fortifications for the Marines who were coming to kill or be killed by them, is nearly 7,000 miles. The men who crossed those distances did so in conditions that combined the physical discomforts of the Atlantic troopship, the overcrowding, the heat below decks, the food, the perpetual motion with a tropical climate that the Atlantic crossing did not produce, and that men from Iowa and Nebraska and Ohio were encountering for the first time. The heat on a troop ship in the South Pacific was a heat that did not relent at night, that rose rather than fell as the ship moved south and west, that made the holds below decks into spaces of accumulated body heat in which sleep was something the body collapsed into rather than something the mind chose. The landing craft represented the final stage of the journey for the men whose war required them to come ashore on defended beaches. And it was a stage that concentrated in the shortest possible time, in the smallest possible space, everything that the journey had been building toward. The Higgins boat, the flat-bottomed landing craft that carried infantry from ship to shore in every major amphibious operation of the war, was 36 feet long and 10 feet wide and carried 36 fully equipped men, which meant that 36 men with 80 pounds of equipment each stood in a space roughly the size of a large living room in seas that the landing craft's flat bottom was designed to cross rather than to manage, for a journey from ship to shore that could last anywhere from 20 minutes to 2 hours, depending on how far offshore the transport vessels were required to stand. The men on the landing craft could not see over the high steel sides. They could hear the incoming fire landing in the water around them. They could feel the craft grounding on the sand or the reef, and the ramp dropping, and the sudden daylight and noise, and the cold water rising up their legs as they stepped off. The journey that had begun with a letter on a Wednesday in Leeds ended here, in this water, at this beach, with the ramp going down, and the war at last making itself fully legible. The German soldiers' journey to the Eastern Front was different in its geography and its character from the British or American experience of deployment, and different in a specific way that shaped everything about what the Eastern Front became. The distances involved were continental rather than oceanic. The railway was the primary mode of movement, and the German military railway system, the Reichsbahn, was, in the opening phases of the war, a logistical instrument of remarkable efficiency, moving divisions from one end of Europe to the other with a speed that the operational plans of the Wehrmacht depended on, and that the men riding the trains experienced as a continuous movement through a landscape that changed from the familiar to the unfamiliar, to the entirely foreign without a clean moment of transition. A German soldier who had joined up in Munich in 1940 and was transported by rail to a forward position outside Smolensk in 1941, had traveled approximately 2,000 kilometers through 5 countries in a sequence of train journeys that took the familiar, the German countryside, the industrial cities, the organized railway infrastructure of Western Europe, and replaced it, kilometer by kilometer, with the vast, flat, incomprehensible scale of the Soviet interior. The Soviet interior at the end of a railway journey in 1941 was a landscape that the men arriving in it struggled to describe to the families they wrote to from the front, because the descriptive vocabulary available to a man who had grown up in Bavaria or Saxony had no adequate terms for a horizon that was simply continuous. There were no mountains. There were no visible limits to the flat agricultural plain that extended in every direction from the point where the train stopped and the men got off and looked around at the country they had been sent to occupy. The villages through which they marched were unlike anything in the Germany they had come. From low wooden structures, unpaved roads, wells rather than running water, an absence of the urban infrastructure that the men associated with civilization, and that announced, in its absence, how far they had traveled from everything they knew. The Russian roads that the Wehrmacht needed for its advance dissolved in rain into tracks of mud that swallowed vehicles to their axles and turned the simple act of moving men from one place to another into an engineering problem that the German army, for all its operational sophistication, had not adequately prepared for. The American GI crossing the Atlantic in 1943 or 1944 was, in many cases, experiencing his first time outside the United States. And the journey itself, before the fighting began, before England or France or the Pacific Islands, resolved from their abstract geographical existence into actual physical places with actual physical characteristics was a process of education about the size of the world that no classroom had provided. Men from Kansas who had never seen an ocean were seeing an ocean. Men from Mississippi who had never been north of Tennessee were standing on the deck of a troopship watching the coast of Britain resolve from the gray horizon. And what they were experiencing was not only the approach of a foreign country, but the expansion of their own sense of what the world was and how much of it there was. The war took men who had been born and raised and employed within a radius of 50 miles and put them on ships and carried them across oceans and deposited them in places that their geography lessons had described, and that the reality of being present in proved to be something entirely different from what description had conveyed. What the journey to war did to the men who made it, the psychological work it performed on the person making it, is something that the military histories pass over in their attention to the movements of units and the logistics of supply. But it was not a neutral experience. The weeks on the troopship, the hours on the train, the particular suspended quality of being in transit between the life you had left and the life you were going to. All of it produced a state of mind that the men who survived described in their memoirs and their letters as a kind of preparation that no formal training had accomplished. You had time to think. You had time to be afraid at a distance from the thing you were afraid of, which was different from being afraid in the presence of it and which served a different purpose. You had time to look at the men around you and understand that you were going to depend on them and they were going to depend on you, not in the abstract way that the training had asserted, but in the concrete way that the shared experience of the journey had demonstrated. The ship made you a unit before the battlefield did, because the ship put you in a situation where the unit was the only available response to the situation. Thomas Woodward arrived in North Africa in the spring of 1943, having traveled by train from Leeds to Southampton, by ship from Southampton to Gibraltar, and by a second ship from Gibraltar to Algiers. The journey had taken 6 weeks. He had been seasick for 11 days of the Atlantic crossing, which he had not mentioned in any of the letters home because his mother worried and there was nothing she could do about the Atlantic Ocean. He had played cards for money he did not have with men from Birmingham and Glasgow, and a single Canadian from a place called Moose Jaw, whose existence he had not previously suspected. He had stood on deck in the Strait of Gibraltar and looked at Spain on one side and Africa on the other, and understood, in the way that geographical reality understood when it presents itself to a person who has previously only encountered it on a map, that he was somewhere he had never been, and that the somewhere he had never been was now the place where his life was going to happen for the foreseeable future. He picked up his kit, he walked down the gangplank. The war was waiting on the dock. If this documentary gave you a deeper and more human understanding of how the soldiers of the Second World War traveled to their war 80 years ago, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, share this video with someone who would find it meaningful, and write in the comments which part of the journey moved you most. Until the next video.